January 1944. A thin winter sun hangs above an airfield in eastern England. Frost glitters on the wings of a line of P-51 Mustangs, silent silver shapes waiting to breathe fire again. Mechanics in oil-stained overalls move between them, their boots. Crunching across the frozen tarmac, one bends beneath the belly of a Mustang, his breath forming clouds that drift into the radiator duct. He is not an engineer from North American aviation. He's a field mechanic, one of hundreds keeping these machines alive on the edge of war. But what he's doing this morning isn't in the manual. A few lengths of shaped metal, a revised airflow gate, and an unapproved adjustment to the radiator exit flap, all aimed at one thing: keeping the Packard built. Merlin cool at 30,000 feet, where German fighters once had the advantage. No paperwork, no authorization. Just a quiet gamble born from observation and necessity. When the engines roar to life moments later, no one realizes that this small act will change how the Mustang fights and how the air war over Europe will end. By the winter of 1944, the air war over Europe had reached a critical phase. The Allies possessed the numbers, but not yet the reach. Flying Fortress and Liberator bombers could hammer targets in France and the Low Countries, but deep inside Germany, over Leipzig, Regensburg, Berlin, they flew alone. Escort fighters simply couldn't go the distance. Those that tried, like the P-47 Thunderbolt or P-38 Lightning, strained against fuel limits and thin air, high above 25,000 feet, where contrails carved white scars across the sky. Engines ran hot, power faded, and mechanical limits decided who lived to see another dawn. The P-51 Mustang had arrived as a strange hybrid, an American-built airframe powered by a British idea. North American Aviation designed it in 1940 for Britain's desperate need, and by late 1942 engineers had grafted on the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Packard Motor Car Company in Detroit then took that Merlin design and began mass-producing it under license, calling it the V1650. Together, they created something new, a fighter that combined long legs, smooth aerodynamics, and high altitude strength. But the perfect marriage between airframe and engine came with a fragile partner: heat. The Merlin's liquid-cooled system was unlike the air-cooled radials that dominated U.S. fighters. It depended on a delicate balance of airflow, coolant circulation, and exhaust pressure. Too much drag from an open radiator flap, and the Mustang lost speed. Too little cooling, and the engine boiled at altitude. Every degree of temperature mattered. But the design incorporated a breakthrough known as the Meredith effect, named for British engineer F.W. Meredith, which used heated air exiting the radiator to produce a small amount of jet thrust. It meant that under ideal conditions, the Mustang's radiator actually helped push the plane forward rather than slowing it down. But those ideal conditions existed only within tight margins of air pressure, flow, and temperature over the frozen expanse of northern Europe in combat climes, or when throttles were wide open. Reality often broke those margins apart. Pilots returning from missions reported wild fluctuations in engine temperature. Some noticed coolant gauges spiking during sustained climbs. Others described how the radiator flap would jam from ice buildup or overpressure. In the maintenance hangars, mechanics logged cases of vapor lock, coolant loss, and heat fatigue on the Packard Merlin seals. Small problems, but at 30,000 feet, small problems killed airplanes. The official technical orders that came with each aircraft listed strict limits: coolant temperature, oil pressure, flap position, all defined in engineering tables. Yet out in the dispersal bays, crews learned that no two Mustangs behaved the same. A flight of 4 could climb together, but one would always run hotter than the rest. That variance infuriated the men who had to keep them running. At bases across England, Leiston, Debden, Bottisham, the Mustang squadrons of the 8th Air Force were learning on the job. Pilots like George Preddy, Doane Gentile, and John Meyer became household names, but behind every sortie was a team of ground men, experimenting, adapting, improvising. They worked in the dark, guided only by experience, noise, and smell. If an engine hissed too soon after shutdown, it meant trapped heat. If the exhaust stacks turned too pale, it meant lean mixture. And then came the cold months when the contrast between freezing ground air and high-altitude heat pushed the system to its limits. Field reports noted radiators bursting seals or coolant crystallizing at startup. Official channels moved slowly. Factories, depots, command offices in Washington. But war didn't wait for signatures. This tense intersection of technology and necessity, the smallest innovation could tip the balance. A rivet, a valve, or a sheet of metal in the right place could mean one more bomber formation reaching its target, or one less fighter spiraling into the channel. By early 1944, the P-51B and P-51C models were the workhorses of the 8th Air Force's long-range escort effort. They carried drop tanks to reach Berlin, yet the high-altitude cold and thin air continued to punish their engines. It was in this environment, amid oil drums, frost, and the hum of overworked generators, that one mechanic began to question the radiator's behavior. He noticed that small changes in flap angle seemed to alter not only cooling but speed. The Meredith effect was supposed to help, but what if it could help more? A question that simple would soon lead to an unapproved modification that redefined high-altitude flight. The 8th Air Force's daylight bombing campaign demanded something the Allies had never truly achieved: dominance at altitude. Each mission pushed deeper into Germany, and each one revealed the same pattern. Bombers unprotected for the last hour of their journey, then torn apart by Bf-109s and FW-190s. In the summer of 1943, losses over Schweinfurt and Regensburg shook commanders to the core. Precision bombing was proving impossible without continuous fighter cover to bridge that gap. Engineers and pilots looked to the Mustang. On paper, its ceiling and range promised salvation. In practice, performance at high altitude was fickle. The Packard Merlin engine was powerful but temperamental. Its two-stage supercharger delivered extraordinary boost at 30,000 feet, but the added heat strained the cooling system. During long climbs or high-speed dives, coolant pressure fluctuated violently. Too much heat, and the engine would blow its glycol, leaving the pilot with a smoking, powerless glider. Miles from home, American depots worked tirelessly to refine the P-51's cooling system. Air Ministry consultants from Britain sent recommendations: adjust flap actuation timing, reduce coolant viscosity, improve radiator intake sealing. Yet these official channels moved in increments measured by bureaucracy, not by urgency. Meanwhile, on forward airfields across East Anglia, the Mustang was earning its reputation through trial and error and through the hands of men who refused to wait. These mechanics were a unique breed. Many were former auto technicians, factory engineers, or farmhands who had learned to keep complex machines running in brutal conditions. They knew every sound an engine made: the cough of a cold start, the whistle of a worn bearing in the freezing English mornings. They would start preheaters at dawn, hands numb, testing coolant lines that often froze solid overnight. When the pilots took off, the mechanics stayed behind, listening to the departing roar until it faded. If a plane didn't return, they cleaned its tools, logged its last service, and moved to the next. At one such airfield, records suggest Leiston, home of the 357th Fighter Group, a small group of mechanics began experimenting after noticing a curious pattern. When the radiator exit flap was fixed at a slightly different angle than standard, the engine temperature stabilized and the aircraft's speed in level flight seemed marginally higher. Official procedure required that flap movement be governed by a thermostatic actuator linked to coolant temperature. But the mechanics had observed that the actuator lagged during rapid temperature changes at altitude, leaving the engine briefly overheated or overcooled. Their solution was simple but daring: modify the geometry of the exit flap control linkage, adjusting its travel to allow a finer balance between cooling and drag. In effect, they were fine-tuning the Meredith effect beyond factory specifications. The alteration was minor, just a reshaped bracket and a Rhindex control arm, but it changed how air accelerated through the duct. The hotter exhaust flow now expanded more efficiently, generating a small yet measurable thrust component. More importantly, the engine stayed cooler longer during sustained boost. No paperwork documented these early field changes. They spread quietly through word of mouth from one crew chief to another through pilots, debriefs and maintenance briefings, runs cooler above 25. One might say, less boil-off on descent. Soon squadrons across England were copying the idea. Some installed adjustable exit flaps that pilots could tweak mid-flight. Others crafted new duct contours from scavenged sheet metal back at North American Aviation and the Packard plant in Detroit. Engineers were puzzled when reports began arriving of Mustangs outperforming factory expectations. Flight logs showed higher average cruise speeds and lower overheating incidents in certain groups. Investigations traced the difference not to new engines or better fuel, but to subtle field modifications. It was an unorthodox success and a dangerous one. Unauthorized changes could void airworthiness, and wartime regulations were strict. But by early 1944, results spoke louder than paperwork. Bomber formations were reaching Berlin with fighter cover intact. Mustang pilots reported chasing German interceptors all the way to the target and back. This quiet mechanical rebellion had already begun changing the air war, and it was about to show in combat just how decisive one unapproved hack could be. Every major innovation in war often starts not in a boardroom, but on the ground, in the hands of a man who sees something wrong and decides not to look away. The Mustang's cooling hack was no exception. The men behind it were not engineers with degrees. They were crew chiefs, flight mechanics, and line maintainers who lived among the aircraft day and night. Their world was relentless 12-hour shifts, freezing winds, tools slipping from oil-covered gloves. Yet within that monotony was deep familiarity. A single vibration or change in engine note could tell a veteran mechanic what was wrong. They knew the smell of burnt glycol, the faint whistle that meant a coolant leak, and the stubborn temperature gauges that refused to stay steady at altitude. Among these men, improvisation was survival. If a seal burst and no replacement arrived, they refitted a truck gasket. If ducting warped, they hammered scrap aluminum into shape. And when the official cooling procedure failed to match real conditions, they tried something different quietly without asking. For them, the unapproved modification wasn't rebellion, it was duty. Pilots trusted their mechanics with their lives, and that bond transcended manuals and orders. When a pilot climbed into a Mustang after dusk and saw the mechanic's thumb raised beneath the wing, he knew every nut and bolt had been tuned with care and with risk. The human heart of the story isn't defiance. It's craftsmanship in wartime. Its core, the Mustang's performance, depended on one of the most elegant aerodynamic ideas of the war, the Meredith effect. It wasn't just a radiator. It was an energy converter. Air entered the duct beneath the fuselage, cooled. The liquid radiator absorbed heat, expanded, and then exited at high velocity through the rear vent. Done correctly, this process created a small thrust enough to offset radiator drag and even add a few miles per hour to top speed. This delicate balance relied on temperature, airflow, and pressure, all behaving as predicted, something that rarely happened in combat. The Merlin engine's immense heat output changed rapidly with throttle input, supercharger boost, and altitude density. At 30,000 feet, air density dropped, heat transfer slowed, and the radiator's efficiency fell. The thermostatic flap actuator simply couldn't react fast enough to maintain equilibrium. That's where the mechanic's hack mattered. By reconfiguring the flap linkage, they improved airflow timing through the radiator tunnel. The modification didn't invent new science. It optimized existing physics. The expelled air now formed a tighter, faster jet stream, improving both thrust and cooling. Flight tests, though unofficial, showed temperature drops of up to -15 degrees Celsius at high boost with negligible drag increase. It was in essence a field-engineered refinement of one of the war's most advanced cooling systems, achieved not in a lab, but in a muddy English hangar. Every change under the cowl affected what happened above the clouds. Before the Cooling fix Mustang pilots often had to reduce power in long climbs to avoid overheating, especially during bomber rendezvous or dogfights that demanded full boost. That single constraint limited pursuit and endurance in the upper air battles where the Luftwaffe still held experience. After the modification spread, those limits softened. Pilots began reporting that they could sustain wide open throttle longer without temperature spikes. This meant faster climbs, tighter escorts, and longer chases over enemy territory. The Mustang's greatest advantage, speed and endurance, could now be used without restraint. It also changed tactics. Fighter groups like the 4th, 357th, and 352nd began employing extended range sweeps ahead of bomber formations, confident they wouldn't lose performance at altitude. The Luftwaffe, already strained by fuel shortages and constant interception duty, found itself confronted by Mustangs that not only reached Berlin but stayed there circling, waiting that edge. A few degrees cooler, a few minutes longer, at full boost reshaped air combat mathematics. The modification wasn't just technical. It was tactical power multiplied. When reports of improved performance reached headquarters, the reaction was cautious. The U.S. Army Air Forces maintained strict control over aircraft modification. Every change to structure or system required authorization through official technical orders, and deviation could lead to disciplinary action. But by 1944, reality was catching up with regulation. Commanders were torn between enforcing rules and recognizing results. Squadron leaders quietly acknowledged that their Mustangs were flying better. Group engineering officers, aware of the risk, began to compile informal notes, revised flap actuation geometry, or modified cooling duct angle, phrased carefully to avoid drawing scrutiny at Wright Field and North American aviation engineers. Eventually confirmed the field reports through controlled tests. The data was undeniable. Reduced coolant temperatures, improved thrust coefficients, and fewer high-altitude boilover incidents. Yet even then, official adoption came slowly, folded discreetly into later models. Rather than publicized as a field innovation, leadership in wartime often walks the line between control and adaptation. The Mustang's cooling modification illustrated that balance. A system flexible enough to absorb unofficial brilliance without collapsing under its own authority. The war machine advanced, not because every rule was followed, but because someone somewhere was brave enough to break one when it mattered, and that spirit of ground ingenuity, meeting command pragmatism, set the stage for the next revelation. What happened when this small mechanical gamble was tested in the heart of battle? From the perspective of the Luftwaffe, the change was invisible, yet its effects were unmistakable. In late 1943, German air intelligence had already begun to track the arrival of the new long-range American fighter. Reports from Jagdgeschwader 26 and 54 described Mustangs of unusual persistence, aircraft that seemed to climb faster, stay longer, and run cooler than before. At first, German pilots dismissed the difference as improved allied fuel or new tactics. But by the spring of 1944, combat debriefs showed a consistent shift. Mustangs were maintaining formation deep into Germany, engaging interceptors at altitudes where the Bf-109G's engine began to strain. The Luftwaffe's own Daimler-Benz DB605 engine suffered chronic overheating above 2500 feet, forcing pilots to throttle back. Meanwhile, American fighters pursued them relentlessly, even at 30,000. German technical officers noticed it too. Wreck analysis of downed P-51s revealed modified cooling ducts and exit flaps that did not match factory blueprints. Luftwaffe engineers speculated that the Allies had improved radiator efficiency or added new thermostatic controls. They were partly right, but what they couldn't have guessed was that this advance wasn't born from Allied industry, but from a mechanic's wrench and intuition on a cold English morning. The effect on German morale was gradual yet corrosive. Once the Reich's defenders believed altitude was their domain, by early 1944, even that advantage was gone. What they couldn't see, the flow of heated air through a modified duct, became one of the quiet forces hastening the Luftwaffe's collapse. War At its core is a contest of adaptation official. Doctrine rewards conformity. Survival rewards creativity. The Mustang's cooling modification embodied that contradiction perfectly for the maintenance crews. The choice to alter government property without approval carried real risk. Every U.S. Army Air Force's mechanic knew that unauthorized modifications could lead to reprimand or grounding. But every one of them also knew that sending a pilot into combat with a known flaw was unthinkable. The decision wasn't about defiance, it was about duty to the men who trusted them in the chaos of 1944 operations. Supply chains were stretched thin. Replacement parts from the United States took weeks to arrive. Mechanics relied on scrap from damaged planes, local British materials, and improvisation. A small change that reduced overheating not only saved engines, but conserved coolant fuel and flight hours. Multiply that across hundreds of sorties, and the logistical gain was immense morally. These acts blurred the boundary between soldier and engineer. They reflected an ethos that victory wasn't only won by those in cockpits, but by those who turned wrenches in the dark. When the modification's success became undeniable, even senior officers quietly accepted that it was the kind of rule-breaking the war demanded. There's a line in a 1944 maintenance report from the 355th Fighter Group: "Field expedients have become doctrine in all but name." That single sentence could have served as the motto for the Mustang's evolution. War was filled with grand strategies and vast technological leaps: radar, jets, rockets. Yet the story of the Mustang's cooling breakthrough reminded the world that innovation often starts small. This single adjustment changed how engineers viewed aircraft systems. It proved that performance wasn't just about engines and aerodynamics, but about managing energy, heat, airflow, and efficiency as a unified whole. After the war, engineers studying captured Mustangs at Farnborough and Wright Field took note of the cooling duct design. The lessons learned there carried into the jet age. Early jet aircraft like the F-86 Sabre borrowed heavily from the Mustang's understanding of internal airflow and thermal management. The idea that heated air could be used constructively rather than wasted. The heart of the Meredith effect found its echo in jet exhaust theory. Even decades later in aerospace design schools, the P-51's radiator remains a case study in elegance and adaptability. What textbooks often omit, however, is that one of its most critical improvements didn't come from a factory drawing, but from a battlefield workshop. The nameless mechanic, or perhaps a handful of them across different bases, embodied the unspoken side of wartime innovation. The courage to adjust the machine, not the doctrine. For the pilot's trust was everything. A Mustang was more than metal. It was the only line between life and death, sky and earth. Before the modification, many flyers treated their temperature gauges with suspicion. A sudden rise could mean a burst coolant line, a forced bailout, or worse, a dive. Through flak and fire in a crippled engine, when the modified cooling system began to prove itself, confidence spread through the ranks. Pilots reported smoother climbs, consistent readings, and a newfound sense of reliability. That confidence was transformative. In air combat, psychology mattered as much as horsepower. A pilot who trusted his machine stayed in the fight longer, flew harder, and made bolder decisions. Was a small invisible reassurance, one that allowed them to push past the point where others once faltered. In the end, that change in mindset might have been the most valuable result of all. Technology altered the aircraft. Trust altered the men, and together that trust and technology would meet their proving ground in the skies over Germany, where the Mustang's true invincibility would finally be tested. April 1944. The sky over central Germany burns with fire and metal. Thousands of feet below the earth is dotted with towns and forests, quiet, unsuspecting, untouched. But above them, the war rages with unrelenting fury. Formation after formation of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators push eastward, their bellies loaded with bombs destined for the heart of the Reich. Ball-bearing plants, aircraft factories, refineries. This is big. Weak, the campaign to break Germany's industrial backbone and its Luftwaffe Months the Allied airmen had paid for every mile of progress in blood and flame. Before the Mustang's arrival, deep raids into German territory were suicidal. P-47s and P-38s that flew escort lacked the range to stay with the bombers all the way to the target. Once they turned back, German fighters pounced. The bombers, slow and exposed, were torn apart. But this morning is different to the bomber crew's men, who had come to expect sudden lonely death over Schweinfurt or Regensburg. Something miraculous happens. Out of the western haze they appear, sleek silver shapes slicing through the contrails. The P-51 Mustangs. At first they seem impossibly graceful. Long noses, bubble canopies, wings that glint like mirrors in the cold morning sun. Then the sound reaches them, the distinctive rising whine of the Packard-built Merlin V1650 engine. A sound that didn't just promise power. It promised survival over. The intercom's voices crackle with disbelief. They're still with us. They're still here. The Mustangs weave in and out of the bomber formations, holding altitude with astonishing ease. To the Germans, this is an unwelcome surprise. They had calculated Allied range limitations to the minute, but the Mustang, with its laminar flow wings and its efficient cooling system, the same unapproved radiator redesign that had quietly altered the airflow dynamics, could fly deeper, climb higher, and fight longer than anything they'd seen before. By noon, the Luftwaffe begins to respond. From bases near Kassel and Hanover, groups of Messerschmitt, the F-109s, and Focke-Wulf Fv-190s scramble into the air. Experienced aces, men like Adolf Galland and Walter Nowotny, lead the charge, determined to intercept before the bombers reach their targets. For years, the Luftwaffe had been confident in its dominance. Their pilots, hardened from years of combat over Europe and Russia, believed that no American escort fighter could challenge them in high altitude performance or energy retention. They were wrong. At 25,000 feet, contrails twist into ribbons of white as both forces collide. The Germans dive from above, guns blazing. The bombers tighten formation. Then, from the sun's glare, the Mustangs fall upon them. The new Merlin-powered P-51s handle like nothing else in the sky. The engine breathes effortlessly at high altitude, delivering smooth, continuous power where the older Allison engine had gasped for air. Combined with the radiator duct's Meredith effect, converting heat into thrust instead of drag, the Mustang gains a marginal but crucial edge. That edge now decides lives. A Luftwaffe Bf-109G latches onto a bomber's tail, its 20mm cannon flashes tearing through the sky. The pilot, a veteran of the Eastern Front, lines up his shot, and then a blur passes beneath him. A silver P-51 pulls a high G vertical climb, looping over the German's canopy. The Mustang's guns thunder, and the Messerschmitt disintegrates in midair. It is not just one duel, it's dozens across the sky, spiraling in every direction. The Prozo disintegrates in midair. It is not just one duel, it's dozens across the sky, spiraling in every direction. Merlin's steady roar becomes the anthem of a new kind of air war. Pilots like James H. Howard, John C. Meyer, and George Preddy push their aircraft to the limits, executing sustained climbs that would have stalled their predecessors. The Mustang's cooling system keeps the engine temperature stable, allowing them to dive, climb, and roll with almost reckless freedom. German ground controllers, listening over their radios, begin to hear distress calls they'd never expected. "See come in Zurich. They're coming back." The hunters have become the hunted. By early afternoon, the bombers reach their target: oil refineries at Luna, aircraft plants at Augsburg, and assembly lines at Regensburg are engulfed in flame. For the first time, the Allies have struck deep into Germany and come back with most of their bombers intact. For the Luftwaffe, this day marks something far greater than tactical loss. It's the shattering of confidence. The German High Command realizes that their once invincible air defense is being systematically dismantled, not just by numbers, but by technology. The Mustang is not merely a better plane. It is the embodiment of an evolution. The Reich failed to anticipate the fusion of British design ingenuity and American manufacturing might. As the bombers turn for home, the Mustangs stay with them, even as fuel gauges dip toward. Empty, they remain circling, guarding, chasing down stragglers. One German ace would later write in his diary, "We had the altitude, the sun, and experience. They had speed, reach, and power, and that day power won." The world didn't know it yet, but the balance of the air war over Europe had just flipped. The cooling hack, once dismissed by engineers, unnecessary tinkering, had now proven decisive in the skies over Germany. It had transformed a promising fighter into a weapon of strategic dominance, and the real test, Berlin itself, was still ahead. March 4, 1944, Berlin. At dawn, the bomb bay doors of more than 600 flying fortresses open over the most forbidden city in Europe. For the first time in the war, American heavy bombers strike the German capital in daylight. It is a moment many thought impossible, not because the bombers lacked courage, but because until recently, no escort could survive the round trip that morning. Every pilot, every gunner, every navigator knew the risks. The Luftwaffe had vowed to make Berlin a graveyard for the 8th Air Force, and as the formation approached, the city radar stations across Germany lit up, guiding hundreds of Bf 109s and FW 190s toward the intruders. But this time the bombers are not alone. At 26,000 feet, flying 1,000 miles from England, a new formation of P-51 Mustangs closes in, the first Allied fighters ever to reach Berlin. Their presence defies logic, distance, and every prior calculation. The Luftwaffe had made the Merlin engines hum steadily, the result of precise cooling balance, the once unapproved innovation that keeps them performing flawlessly even after hours in thin air. Too. The men on the ground, it must have been a surreal sight. Silver fighters arcing through the contrails over Berlin itself, chasing German interceptors across their own skies. For the first time, the hunters have come home to roosting. One of the most telling encounters of the air war. Colonel Donald Blakesley, commanding the 4th Fighter Group, leads his Mustangs into the teeth of German resistance. His group dives through flak bursts so dense they resemble black curtains. Blakesley, a veteran of the Eagle squadrons, radios coolly to his men, "Go get them boys. Don't come back until you're out of ammo," and they do. Over the next 30 minutes, the sky above Berlin turns into a maelstrom of vapor trails and smoke. Mustangs slash through Luftwaffe formations with surgical precision. German aces, accustomed to exploiting the altitude advantage, find their aircraft matched or outperformed at every level. The P-51's ability to maintain high boost pressure, thanks to its efficient radiator flow, allows it to retain energy longer during climbs and turns. As the battle unfolds, a single Mustang pilot, Captain William R. Banks, locks onto a Me-109 that attempts a splits maneuver to escape. Banks pushes his throttle forward, ramming the engine to emergency power. The temperature gauge spikes, but the coolant holds steady, the airflow system doing its job. The German fighter can't pull away. Banks fires a short burst. The Me-109 disintegrates, vanishing into black smoke. This wasn't supposed to be possible. Before the cooling redesign, P-51 prototypes suffered severe heat losses at altitude. Coolant temperature fluctuations would force pilots to reduce power, losing precious seconds in combat. That mechanical constraint had now been removed, and the difference between life and death in aerial combat often lasted seconds. The result was devastating. By mid-1944, Luftwaffe intelligence reports recorded a 60% increase in fighter losses compared to the previous year. German pilots complained that the Americans now fought with impossible endurance. The myth of air superiority, the backbone of the Luftwaffe's morale, began to crumble. Yet the Mustang's rise wasn't merely mechanical, it was psychological. Every time the Merlin engine's smooth hum echoed across Europe, it carried a message. The Reich skies were no longer safe. Luftwaffe pilots returning from combat found their bases strafed by the same Mustangs that had chased them hours earlier in one chilling mission. April 11, 1944, Mustangs from the 355th Fighter Group attacked a German airfield at Gardelegen. They destroyed more than 40 enemy aircraft on the ground. The Luftwaffe's operational strength fell below 40% in some sectors within weeks, even experienced aces men like Johann Steinhoff and Gunther. Rahl admitted privately that the Mustang had changed the war's rhythm. The Luftwaffe was now fighting defensively, reacting instead of dictating. Behind these victories lay a quiet mechanical truth. The Mustang could do what no other escort fighter could: fly to Berlin, fight, and come home. That range and reliability were inseparable from its engine and cooling system's efficiency. For every degree of drag saved by the redesigned ductmore, fuel endurance was gained, more speed preserved. By the summer of 1944, when Allied ground forces stormed Normandy, the Mustang was no longer just an escort, it was a symbol of Allied supremacy. Squadrons flew fighter sweeps deep into enemy airspace, hunting for any remaining German resistance. Luftwaffe bled dry of veteran pilots, began sending inexperienced recruits into battle. Many never returned. Their Me-109s and FW-190s, once the terror of the skies, became targets, and Allied intelligence officer later summarized it coldly: "We didn't just outnumber them, we outlasted them in air and fuel, in machines." By late 1944, the transformation was complete. What had started as a desperate engineering adjustment on a test bench in North America had evolved into the most consequential technical advantage of the European air war. The unapproved cooling hack, once dismissed as a minor airflow experiment, had enabled sustained high-performance flight where others failed. The Meredith effect, duct fine-tuned and integrated seamlessly into the Mustang's design, turned heat into usable thrust, extending range and speed simultaneously. And through that, the P-51 became the aircraft that broke the Luftwaffe's spine when Berlin fell. A year later, American Mustangs were still flying overhead, guarding the skies they had once fought to reach. The age of air dominance had arrived. Flames over Berlin slowly fade, the wreckage falls silent. But in the hangars across England, engineers already understand this victory is not just about courage or numbers. It is about engineering that changed destiny, and that realization will echo into the next phase of the war, the aftermath, when the Allies finally claimed the skies as their own spring. 1945. The air over Europe is strangely quiet. The sky that once screamed with engines and gunfire now hums with the low drone of Allied patrols sweeping over the shattered remains of the Reich. On the ground below, smoke drifts lazily from cities reduced to ash: Hamburg, Dresden, Berlin, Germany's Onseproud Luftwaffe, the guardian of the Third Reich skies, has been beaten not only by numbers but by endurance, innovation, and the relentless evolution of the Allied air war. The change had not been sudden. It had been mechanical, invisible, born in the silent hum of a radiator beneath a polished fuselage. By early 1945, the P-51 Mustang had become more than an aircraft. It was an ecosystem of superiority. The Allies could now launch long-range bomber raids anywhere in occupied Europe, with full fighter coverage from the oil fields of Ploiesti to the factories of Vienna and the industrial heart of the Ruhr. Each mission stretched further, longer, deeper. Each time the Mustangs went with them and returned. The impact on the Luftwaffe was catastrophic. In January 1944, German fighter command still maintained around 2,000 operational aircraft. 1 year later, barely 600 remained combat-ready, with the majority destroyed on the ground or lost to mechanical failure, fuel shortages, and Allied attacks. The Luftwaffe's greatest weakness was not courage, but exhaustion. The very machine that once embodied German engineering precision now faced an enemy it could not outpace or outlast. When the Allied bombing campaign intensified under Operation Point-Blank, the Luftwaffe's defensive network began to collapse from within. Radar sites were overwhelmed, communication lines jammed, and supply depots annihilated. The few remaining pilots, many barely trained, were thrown into combat with as little as 50 flight hours. Their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs were fast, but their engines overheated easily at high altitude, while the P-51's Merlin ran flawlessly mile after mile. Its cooling system maintaining perfect equilibrium. Even under full power, the statistics were merciless. Between February and June 1944, Luftwaffe fighter losses exceeded 2,500 aircraft, a number from which German aviation would never recover. The Mustang, once considered an auxiliary escort, now flew in absolute control of the European sky. But the numbers told only half the story. Every bomber that returned to base carried more than a payload's worth of damage. It carried morale. Crews who had once believed their missions suicidal now felt protected. Their survival rates increased dramatically. In late 1943, before the Mustang's arrival, bomber losses sometimes reached 20% per mission. By late 1944, those losses dropped below 5%. The difference was life. Thousands of airmen who came home instead of vanishing into smoke. The Luftwaffe, once the spearhead of Blitzkrieg, was now grounded by its own defeat in the skies. Fuel reserves dwindled to a fraction of operational need. Experienced pilots were dead or captured. New aircraft designs like the Me-262 jet arrived too late to fuel, and with too little fuel to alter the outcome. And the Mustang, agile and omnipresent, made sure of it. They patrolled every airfield, every transport route, every desperate attempt to regroup. German locomotives and supply convoys were shredded by low-level strafing runs. Airfields became graveyards of twisted aluminum, blackened Me-109 smoldering. FW-190s, their wings snapped like paper to the soldiers on the ground. The whine of the Merlin became an omen. It was the sound of inevitability back in England, the engineers who had fought their own quiet war with slide rules. Test benches and airflow charts finally saw the scale of their achievement. What had begun as a rejected concept on a North American factory floor, a small adjustment to radiator ducting, had become a cornerstone of Allied victory. The Meredith effect, once theoretical, was now vindicated in combat. By transforming waste heat into thrust, it allowed the Mustang to gain efficiency instead of losing it. The result: greater speed, longer range, higher performance, and unmatched reliability. It was proof that engineering, not just bravery, could change the trajectory of war. In after-action reports, bomber commanders credited the Mustang for making daylight bombing possible. General Carl Spaatz, head of U.S. Strategic Air Forces, would later remark, "Without the P-51, we could not have defeated the German Air Force when we did. Even the enemy acknowledged it." Luftwaffe ace Johann Steinhoff, reflecting after the war, said bluntly, "The Mustang destroyed the Luftwaffe. It was superior in every respect: speed, climb range, and numbers." When it appeared the outcome was decided. By April 1945, when Soviet forces closed on Berlin from the east and American columns from the west, the Mustangs roamed freely above the ruins of the Reich. They were no longer just escorts, they were guardians of victory. In their cockpits sat young men who had once looked up at the sky and seen death. Now they looked down and saw history ending beneath them. The war in the air was over. The P-51 had won it not through overwhelming firepower alone, but through a single act of mechanical brilliance that made flight itself more efficient, more enduring, and in its own way more human. Smoke would clear, but the lessons would remain, lessons that would shape the next generation of jet engines, airframes, and cooling systems for decades to come. And as the guns fell silent, one question remained. What did this victory mean not only for the Allies, but for the evolution of air power itself? That answer lies in the next and final movement of this story, the Aftermath Section 2, where the Mustang's legacy would take flight into the jet age and beyond. The war had ended, but the shadow of its machines remained. On the quiet airfields of England, France, and Italy, rows of P-51 Mustangs sat motionless beneath the spring sunlight. Their wings, once streaked with exhaust and cordite, now gleamed silver, and still ground crews walked past them in silence, knowing that these aircraft had done more than just fight. They had changed what flight itself meant. When the guns finally stopped and Europe fell into uneasy peace, the Mustang's journey was far from over. It had earned its place not just as a weapon of victory, but as a blueprint for the future of aviation. In the months following Germany's surrender Allied, engineers began dissecting what had made the P-51 so efficient. The results surprised even its creators. Wind tunnel studies confirmed that the redesigned cooling system, the same unauthorized idea first mocked as impractical, had reduced the aircraft's drag by nearly 15%. That alone accounted for the Mustang's ability to cruise faster, longer, and higher than its contemporaries. Aerodynamicists called it the elegance of necessity, a perfect marriage of physics and pragmatism. By converting excess engine heat into thrust through the Meredith effect, the P-51's radiator had become a small jet engine of its own. Every other fighter in the world lost power to cooling drag. The Mustang gained it. That principle would later influence jet intakes, compressor cooling, and even supersonic airflow design. The Mustang's efficiency wasn't just a wartime accident, it was a glimpse of aviation's future. North Americans' engineers, led by Edgar Schmude, were already thinking ahead. Their post-war designs, including the F-86 Sabre, carried direct DNA from the Mustang. Laminar flow wings, optimized cooling ducts, and aerodynamic balance between speed and endurance. When the F-86 later faced Soviet MiG-15s over Korea, its lineage was unmistakable. Mustang had taught a generation how to win not through raw power, but through refined performance. By 1950, the world was at war again. This time in Korea, jet aircraft ruled the skies. Now, but the Mustang was called back, reborn as the F-51DV. Same machine that had once battled Messerschmitts now flew close air support for ground troops, strafing enemy supply lines and tanks. Its liquid-cooled Merlin still purred with reliability. Even in the freezing Korean winters, pilots affectionately called it Old Faithful. Though it could no longer match the speed of jets, the Mustang's endurance and precision proved invaluable. It could loiter above the front lines for hours, something early jets couldn't do. In one mission report, a pilot wrote, "The Mustangs don't just fly the mission, they live there." It was the end of an era, the last piston-driven fighter to fight alongside jets, closing the circle it had begun. A decade earlier, by the mid-1950s, most Mustangs were retired or sold to Allied nations. Yet wherever it flew, South America, Israel, the Philippines, Sweden, it carried the same unmistakable sound, the same legacy of speed and survival. In the years after the war, historians and engineers finally gave credit where it was due. The quiet innovators who had pushed the Mustang's radiator, redesigned men like Edgar Schmude, James Kindleberger, and a handful of test engineers at North American, were recognized for their ingenuity. The cooling system that had once been marked unnecessary modification in technical memos became a case study in aeronautical engineering schools worldwide. Its principle, using waste energy for propulsion, would appear in textbooks, lectures, and even NASA research decades later. For the pilots who flew it, the Mustang was something more personal. It was a partner, a protector, a living machine that felt as if it wanted to survive. Many described it with reverence. George Preddy, one of the highest-scoring Mustang aces, had once said before his final mission, "She talks to you. The Mustang tells you what she wants. If you listen, she'll bring you home." That sentiment outlasted the war, restored P-51s still take to the skies at air shows across the world, their Merlin engines singing the same haunting, confident tone that once echoed over Europe. To the veterans watching from below, that sound is memory itself, victory rendered in pitch and steel. By the time the jet age fully arrived, the P-51's legacy had already taken flight in new forms. Its aerodynamic lessons shaped everything from Cold War fighters to modern passenger jets. Even its philosophy, maximizing efficiency through innovation, became an enduring principle of aerospace design. Every aircraft that came after, in some way, carried a whisper of that unapproved hack, and for historians, the Mustang's triumph became a symbol of something deeper. That progress in war often begins not with orders from above, but with curiosity from below, from the mechanic, the engineer, the pilot who dares to ask, "What if?" That single question had given birth to an idea, That idea became a modification, and that modification changed the course of air warfare, perhaps even the war itself. By the late 20th century, the P-51 had transcended its role as a weapon. It became a legend, not of destruction, but of design. At airfields and museums, its story is told again and again, how a humble engineer's insight into airflow turned a good fighter into a great one. How a rejected blueprint helped win the sky. How the hum of a radiator could rewrite history. The sound of the Merlin fades now into history's distance, but its echo, the hum that once meant survival, still carries through the ages, a reminder that even in war, brilliance often begins with one man, one idea, and one refusal to accept the limits of what already works. In the grand theater of the Second World War, few machines ever achieved what the P-51 Mustang did, not just in performance, but in legacy. It began as an unproven gamble born of necessity and ambition. Yet by the war's end, it stood as the perfect synthesis of art, science, and courage, a fighter that not only dominated the skies but redefined aerial warfare itself. The unapproved cooling modification, a small act of engineering rebellion, became the heartbeat of that success. What started as an experimental tweak by a single mechanic evolved into one of aviation's most elegant solutions. A fighter that used the very air rushing against it to cool itself, to thrive where others faltered. It turned drag into thrust, heat into endurance, and risk into advantage. That is the hidden poetry of the P-51. It wasn't just a product of design. It was a triumph of human persistence. It proved that innovation often comes not from official plans or sanctioned laboratories, but from restless minds in hangars, people who see beyond blueprints, who dare to question what can't be done. When we hear the distant growl of a restored Mustang today slicing through modern skies, it carries more than nostalgia. It carries a lesson that progress is rarely linear, and that sometimes history changes because one person refused to settle for good enough. The Mustang story is not just about aluminum engines or aerodynamics. It's about conviction, the belief that even a single idea applied at the right moment can shift the balance of a world at war. And as sunlight glints off its polished wings in flight museums or air shows, the P-51 remains what it has always been, a symbol of what happens when vision, ingenuity, and courage converge, soaring higher than anyone ever thought possible.